All right, thanking God for, among other things, the way in which he can help us understand what truly matters. Let's call First Corinthians chapter 13, the famous chapter on love, when. But likewise, let's subtitle it, Rejoice. Why, God willing, will be apparent by the time we get to the end of the chapter. That, in the way of rough summary, breaks down into roughly 4 paragraphs, the last paragraph being a single verse, that being verse 13. But using when as a structural guide for the chapter summary, the first 3 verses may describe what my gifts look like when I lack love. Understanding that in chapter 12, he was talking about how in some ways their gifts had become vain in the absence of genuine concern for one another. He is going to describe 3 ways in which their gifts have become empty, saying that in one way, the gifts have become vain. In some ways, they can potentially become nothing, and they can potentially gain nothing no matter how much they sacrifice. In verses 4 through 7, he is going to make it more personal, talking about the way that he becomes a certain type, or he displays certain characteristics when he is actually functioning in love. And likewise, there are certain things he will not do, or he will not allow himself to become when he is genuinely functioning in love. As he'll move in verses 8 through 12, really through the end of the chapter, to talk about the time comparison between love and the things that they are fixated on, understanding that they are fixating on things that are temporary, and he is going to help them understand things that are eternal, not the least of which, actually the most significant of which, being love. A famous verse that ends up, so now faith, hope, and love abide, these 3, but the greatest of these is love. But taking the summary a little bit more slowly with regard to those things that are rendered vain or empty without love, he is going to say, if he speaks with the tongues of men and angels but have not love, he is a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. Thus the summary offered, or the synonym, it basically sounds like he is describing vain skills. Then he'll go on to talk about he is nothing when, or if he has prophetic powers, he can understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and if he has all faith so as to remove mountains. But if he doesn't have love, he literally describes himself as nothing. As he's going to say, he gains nothing in verse 3 when he says, if I give away all I have and I deliver up my body to be burned, but have not love, I gain nothing. A concept that we, God willing, will circle back to in the thematic summaries, but that all sets the stage for him talking about what it looks like when he is genuinely focusing in genuine concern for the believers around him. He is going to say that he is patient and kind in verse 4, skipping down to verse 6. He's going to say that he rejoices with the truth. He, in a relatively obscure statement, is going to say he bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, and endures all things when he is functioning in love. And of course, I'm projecting that onto Paul because it's literally going to say that these are the things that love does in comparison to the things that love does not. Going back to verse 4, he's going to say it does not envy, it does not boast, it is not arrogant or rude, it does not insist on its own way, it is not irritable or resentful, and does not rejoice at wrongdoing. Something that, once again, I want to circle back to in the discussion of the points that really, I guess, impacted me most in looking at the chapter this time. As by way of a more detailed summary, as he's talking about that whole concept of timeline. In verse 8, he's going to talk about the whole concept of the timeline of what they're fixated on, the temporary nature of looking flashy or having nice gifts, skills, talents, etc., versus things that matter more. He's going to pick that up again, as we already read in verse 13, the very last verse of the chapter. But he's going to come right out in verse 8 and say, love never ends, as opposed to the things that they are fixated on, the spiritual gifts. He's going to say, as for prophecies, temporary. Tongues, temporary. Knowledge is going to pass away. But he's going to say, back on to that whole concept of when the perfect comes, the partial will pass away. And so what will actually endure? Well, he's going to compare that whole concept of perfection when it comes to 2 things. One, when he was a child, the way that he reasoned, and then how things are right now, both things that are passing away. So when he says in verse 9, for we know in part and we prophesy in part, he's talking about right now. He's saying that's partial. Fixate on the things that are preparing you for a time when God brings things into perfection. Well, how do I do that? Well, first of all, you understand that where you are right now is kind of childlike in comparison to what God is going to help us or help you to become if you fixate on the things that are eternal and don't get swept away with the things that he's getting rid of. And so he's going to say in verse 11 in the famous passage, when I was a child, I spoke like a child, I thought like a child, and I reasoned like a child. But when I became a man, I gave up childish ways. Moreover, verse 12, for now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Now in part, now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I have been fully known. And I want to pause there because the advice that he is giving reminds us of something we're going to see in Hebrews, where it's going to remind us that if they died under the law of Moses on the word of 2 or 3 witnesses, Moses was one who was a witness, simply a spokesman for what he had been told, but he had not seen the heavenly places. He's going to say, how much worse will the judgment be for those who despise or disregard the words of Christ, the one who does know what it's like in the heavenly places, a theme that we remember from time to time that this chapter reminded me of as well. The one who is telling us about the things that are eternal, the things that we should fixate on, is the one who has seen what it's like in the heavenly places. And so in helping us to refocus our attention, he's helping us to understand, as we've talked about, the need to avoid the culture shock of what it would be like in heaven after not having adequately used our time on earth to prepare for where we are going, fixating on where we are at the expense of being prepared to overcome the culture shock, if we are even fortunate enough to get to be culture shocked, because there's only so much distance that we can allow to grow between ourselves and who God is calling us to be before he just doesn't want to be around us forever. And that's the hard news. But for years, we've spent time talking about the whole concept of hell when we thought it applied to others. But the reality is God is no respecter of persons. And he is saying to all of us, whether we have spent years in the church or not, there's only so much distance that we can allow to grow between ourselves and who God has called us to be before he simply doesn't want to be around us forever. A recurring theme that this chapter on love is reminding us of. And that stood out to me in at least a couple of ways. One, in verse 2, when he says, if I have not love, I am nothing. Reminding me of what he says back in chapter 9 toward the end when he is comparing this life to a race. Verse 24, do you not know that in a race all runners run, but only one receives the prize? So run that you may obtain it. Every athlete exercises self-control in all things. They do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable. So I do not run aimlessly. I do not box as one beating the air, but I discipline my body and keep it under control, lest after preaching to others, I myself should be disqualified. Paul seems to have it in mind and in heart that God wants him in heaven, but he does not need him in heaven. And even as an apostle, if he does not discipline his ways according to the way that God has called him to live out his life, then he can be disqualified as well. Going back to what he said in chapter 3, where he talked about the potential for them to suffer loss without losing their salvation, telling them that the foundation that he has laid is one that they have to take care and build on properly. Why? Because it's going to be tested by fire, as we mentioned, in much the same way that the entire Old Testament ends up talking about the way that God will refine his people through fire, oftentimes seeming to describe the fiery trials of life. And he says there's a way that your work, if it's not done effectively according to the way that God has called you to teach his word or to live out your life, you can have your works burned up and still be saved, even though by fire. You're still going to suffer loss in the course of salvation, and not necessary loss, unnecessary loss that comes with building upon the foundation that God has laid in the wrong way. But then he then goes on to talk about, don't think that that's the only loss that you can suffer, because you can also do things in a way that you can also do things in a way that is destructive to God's people or his temple. And that could potentially provoke him to repay the destruction that we have done to God's people with the destruction he would then turn on us. But God willing, in a chapter that's devoted to love, that's not what we would have to worry about, insofar as we mentioned in recent chapters, we take the counsel that Paul is giving not only to the Corinthians, but for us. and turn towards God, understanding that we all have some turning to do. And with that, the blessing in fixating on things that are eternal is really twofold. One, we can put the whole fear of condemnation or destruction behind us altogether. But more importantly, in verse 3, if we allow God to refocus us on things that matter, things that last beyond our here and now, then likewise, we don't have to have the regret that goes along with losing the things that we've done in the name of God because we've chosen to go about doing them the wrong way. And thus, verse 3, where he says, if I give away all I have to the poor and deliver up my body to be burned, I can sacrifice myself in a way that without love still leaves me gaining nothing. And so even though other epistles will say that your labor is not in vain, it qualifies that your work or your labor in the Lord is not in vain. And likewise, here in chapter 13, he seems to be reminding us that that does not extend us a blank check to do things without genuine compassion and concern for others, because to the degree we lack genuine concern or love for others, he is helping us to understand that we run the risk of doing a lot of things in God's name, but having him break the news to us that those things were actually done in vain. But beyond the basics, knowing that we need to love one another as hard as that can be to practically live out, he's going to give us some practical red flags for understanding when we are walking in genuine compassion for others and when we are not. And that's basically summed up in verses 4 through 7. But the reason why we called, or I hoped, to look at this chapter through the lens of rejoicing is that in verse 6, it's going to say one of the characteristics of what love does not or is not, it's going to say it does not rejoice at wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. And that reminded me of this whole concept of natural affection. One of the things I seem to be seeing more and more is a comfort level or a natural affection for wrongdoing, finding a foothold in more and more of the places that claim to be church or Christian or followers of Christ. And likewise, one of the things that can help us overcome the room that we may be carving out for growing an affection for wrongdoing is asking ourselves, likewise, have we lost our natural affection for truth? And if we can look honestly in the mirror and ask God to show us whether or not we have gained too much an affection for wrongdoing while losing our affection for truth, then no matter how great a distance we might have allowed to slip between where we are and where God has called us to be, we might be taking an effective step toward getting back to the business of being transformed into the kind of people that, as we say from time to time, God wants to be around forever.